I have. I've already completed Sleeping Dogs a while ago. And Sleeping Dogs is a confusing, it's also a confusing history. Sleeping Dogs is actually a scrap game that was a sequel to another game, and I forgot which game series it was. But it was scrapped, sold to Square Enix. Uh, or it might, was it Square Enix back then? Yeah, it was sold to Square, and Square repurposed it and published it under the Sleeping Dog name. And then it never had a sequel after that. Yeah, it's the one that takes place in China. Although Sleeping Dogs do share the organized crime, it's more of a GTA than it is a RGG. So RGG tends to heavily focus on slice of life stuff. Sleeping Dog is still closer to like Sleeping Dogs is still closer to Rockstar Games and like things like Cyberpunk and yeah. I enjoyed it quite a lot because of the context. Um, it was specifically important to me because it was relating to the Chinese culture. And it's one of those series that a lot of people want to see come back. The only drawback for me is Sleeping Dogs could end up being a great cop drama. It's a cop drama. So Hong Kong entertainment and stuff does cop dramas a lot. However, it's like Mafia and GTA as opposed to RGG. So it's about crime specifically, and it's really great about that. It's just it doesn't do and okay, and it's kind of hard because it's China. So that one of the biggest downsides to a title like that is that it's very difficult to do depictions of China. Like Japan is already tough. Japan is already tough, but Japan is a little bit more open about representation of their crime and like it was already tough for RGG to tackle organized crime and police and corruption and stuff in this game series. China is incredibly tough because these are face cultures. So anything that would depict their country in a potentially questionable way is very sensitive. So typically Rockstar has less resistance when it comes to like doing what they do, using what they do in the United States with like GTA and stuff. But RGG is doing something that's unprecedented for Japan. However, Sleeping Dogs takes place in China. And China is tough. Like it's it deals with reputation and stuff, and I understand that quite a bit because I'm multiculturally Chinese, and it is very important to keep up image and public, like the public perception. So I don't think Sleeping Dogs is the closest thing to Sleeping Dogs that can happen is like a game series like Mafia, where Mafia takes place not in the country of origin, but the country's facsimiles in the United States. So it is possible to probably have, like, say, a Sleeping Dogs sequel, spiritual sequel, take place in, like, Hell's Kitchen in New York City or something like that. And that's where Mafia takes place too. So, like, most of the immigration centers, a lot of times that stuff is a lot more open and people want to normalize that because it's true, it's historical. Instead of In the United States, it's a little bit more open in the idea that we want to learn from exposure. So when things like this, it can be entertaining, but it can also be educational. And that's why RGG, does this game violate? There's no this game has very little to do with depicting the depiction of Chinese, like, at all. Like, what I mean is, this game, RGG is only giving Japanese perspectives on Chinese immigrants. That's the closest thing, and that's more or less the same as in the United States, where your depiction of Chinatown is based on the United States Chinatown, or RGG's Chinatown is based on Japanese Chinatown. I mean, it probably creates some friction though, and most of it, just to be incredibly clear, most games that are disagreeable in any way, is not available in China anyways. Like, the whole that Chinese censorship tends to be irrelevant to game design outside of it. I don't think there's any legalities in terms of people encountering it outside of China, for example. However, it is tough when you use Chinese imagery, especially modernization. However, things that are fair game in China tends to be things that come out of China, and if you're using that as a representation, it's typically folklore, fantasy, work ethic, sci-fi. Those things tend to be okay. So, like, for example, the next big title that's going to come out of China is Black Myth Wukong, which is Monkey King. And then you're always going to have like a Three Kingdoms game or something that deals with folklore. So all that stuff is still a common thing that involves China and out and inside China. It's basically a cultural schism, right? It's a difference in culture. In the United States, as a multinational American, Americans tend to want to embrace and see things and explore things in order to grow from them. In a face culture, it's usually more preferable to keep working on the problems, but not accentuate or normalize the problems to the public. So when you have problems, you solve them discreetly. In the United States, it's a lot more open to, it's a more of a help culture where to see the problem and discuss the problems and see the problems make it so that the people there can collaborate to solve the problem, as opposed to, if you have a problem, you deal with it, you solve it yourself. Everyone should be able to solve their own problems. So it's kind of ironic, but problem solving, in my opinion, tends to be a lot more collaborative or require collaboration in the United States. I'm just gonna say generally in the United States. And in the Asian cultures, it tends to be individualized. However, solving those problems individually is for the perspective of preserving the communal image, while the United States solving problems tend to come with individual accolades. So, like, on the one hand, United States and other westernized countries tend to emphasize the individual, the contribution of the individual and uniqueness. In order to solve problems, they tend to involve collaborative awareness. And then in the Asian culture, at least for myself personally, anecdotally, is I want to, if I have problems, I solve the problems myself in the interest of preserving the communal image. So if I have a problem, I make sure that it does not reflect poorly on what I represent. It's really counterintuitive to a lot of individuals on how problems are solved when it contradicts their philosophy in some way. So like, for example, a face culture tends to be incredibly communal, as in, do not bring shame on your culture, right? You do as much as you can to not bring shame, but ultimately when there is problems, you try to do it as discreetly as possible, not openly as possible. And then in the United States, when there is a problem, you tend to share the problem in order to solve it. However, it's individually focused. So like, I have a problem. Can all of you look at my problem and see if you can help me? Or, you know, it's more willingness in sharing the burden as opposed to not burdening others. So on the one hand, my Chinese side would say, if I have a problem, I shouldn't burden other people with my problem, especially my fellow countrymen, right? People who I share a culture with. I should not burden them with my problems. Alternatively, in the United States, it's like, I have a problem, it's okay to ask for help. Some problems are sometimes hard for one person or one family to solve. So you make that public so that the whole, ironically, more people can help solve a problem. And that kind of filters into all of this, especially organized crime, poverty, the depiction of poverty, organized crime, and corruption in government. These three are inherently incredibly touchy things for Eastern culture, because it's a reflection on the weaknesses and problems of that culture. But in the United States, when you see video games that deals with American problems, they're everywhere. And they're so everywhere that it makes it feel, for better or for worse, it's so openly well known that if you are an American, like myself, and other countries look at the United States, since the problems are constantly openly shared, it becomes stereotype. It becomes the stereotype that the United States tend to have the most problems, especially the most cultural problems. But that's seeing is believing kind of thing. You have to understand, I mean, like, it's worth emphasizing that since the United States is openly often sharing their problems, it doesn't mean when a country doesn't share problems, there aren't problems with the country. We all have our problems, and you always want to wish that either openly or discreetly that everyone on this planet can be able to solve their problems and find like a mutual net positive, you know, world they can live in. Just some of us, some cultures are far more expressive and open about their problems, and other cultures are not. And it's all linked to how they deal with, you know, how they problem solve, how they take care of themselves, what's more priority. And rarely am I suggesting one is better than the other or anything is better. The idea is these are different systems that exist to promote a country that wants their citizens and people to thrive. And that's the limitation of creative freedom. So whether that's bad or not, my life is a crossroad between east meets west, and it's difficult for me to be on, like, have a thought on any of those things, like, in an opinion way. I can see why it's so nice to have a game like this, why it's difficult to have a game like Sleeping Dogs, and why it's far more reasonable and celebrated to have a game like GTA 5. It's, one of the bigger reasons why I play games like these, because it tells you a lot about the people's culture through their creative works. It would be great to play other games like this, like maybe if a French developer decides, hey, we're going to make Paris, or, like, you know, your standard touristy areas, a game too, and explore the same thing, then I would play that game and try to glean something from their culture. It's been a wild ride. Anyways, that's a slight digression for the... Am I fighting now? No. Hi. Yeah, just a slight digression. That's what these games make me think all the time. I did like Sleeping Dogs though.
And stay down.
It I was a much younger person. Well, not that much younger. It was like 3 years ago. I think I played Sleeping Dog 3 years ago, and there I have a history. I have a long history with Hong Kong cinema, specifically Hong Kong cinema and other Chinese cinema, but a lot of it deals with cop drama, and cop drama and organized crime is a mainstay for a while coming out of Hong Kong. Nowadays, I'm not sure how big that is anymore. It's difficult to be an Asian person or anyone. Like, I'm not like Chinese, you know, native Chinese, but it's still difficult for me to forget, or, like, not forget, but to embrace the American, like the westernized, largely American lifestyle and culture with my Chinese values. So things that my parents would, things that my family, details of my family and whatnot, like things we struggle with and stuff, we don't openly express those things. But if I was talking to an American audience, that stuff, like having American friends, it's entirely different. It's incredibly, like, living in a life where I bounce between circles of Chinese Americans and then exclusively other multinational Americans, but excluding Asian regions. Sitting down, we talk about our problems, we share about them. It actually creates here's one of the ways of coping that differentiates between Asians and Americanized people really, really phenomenally, that I tend to highlight a lot, is the whole misery deserves company thing. So when we talk, it is far more common for westernized people to sit around and share their problems together and offer euphemisms, or like things that sound nice, and then that bond, that, like, the suffrage, as in the overcoming perseverance, but while openly sharing vulnerability, that is a form of bond that happens more commonly, even to between strangers in a westernized culture, especially the United States, because we have a lot of problems and we openly share them so that we can openly address them with everyone. In a Chinese situation, like if I were sitting around with relatives and whatnot, it's more of celebrating our merits. So we talk about what we do right. We don't share our problems with each other. We talk about what we have accomplished. So often it's proactive. It can be very positive enforcing. It can create rivalries, which drives performance. So like my parents would sit next to, I don't know, my distant cousin or something, and they would talk about, oh yeah, you know, my children are doing super well. They just ace this and now they're doctors, and then say, oh, your kids are doctors too. My kids are doctors, you know, that kind of thing. It's about image. So you're not trying to you're trying to not necessarily embellish but tell the truth, but highlight all the good things. It almost becomes like competition in its own right, but not competition in the same sense of the United States. The United States tend to be competitive in a more nondescript way. It's not exclusive. So when someone's suffering, for example, here's the double edge, right? When you sit around and you talk about how bad your life is, in the United States, there's a tendency to the competitive nature is in a behavior that is non-discriminatory. So what I mean is there's no conditional. In Chinese ways, you're thinking positive things. It's not about negative things. You think of positive things. I'm successful, you're successful. We don't talk about failures. Rarely failures. But in the United States, it's nondescript. It's everything can be competitive. So it reflects the American culture. Here's a good example. Oh yeah, I just saved a lot of money on my car insurance. And then someone says like, oh yeah, me too. I can save even more. I'm saving even more with that car insurance. You should try this car insurance because then both of us can save a lot. That's a positive thing. But it could also be the other way around and say like, oh dude, my life sucks right now. It's like, oh, if it makes you feel any better, my life sucks even more. So it's everything. It's a really peculiar thing about what makes at least the United States culture run really well. So it's wonderful, but it comes with its own things, and definitely for the Chinese culture, it comes with different things too. And by extension, I'm really invested in the Japanese culture at arm's length, I guess, because I've never been to Japan and I can't be born Japanese. I can't grow up being Japanese anymore. Right? So, as limited as possible as an American looking in on Japan, I also understand that type of perspective in Japan just because I happen to share Asian values. Of course, I don't understand anything, but I try my best to understand my level of English in order to get out. For the most part, I'm glad that. Yeah, yeah, it's one of those things. I don't want to give you the impression that, say, like I'm an American, right? I don't want to give you the impression that things should be whatever way it's supposed to be. Most of the time, what's interesting about these games and art and YouTube and stuff is to talk about what it really is. Like, not my opinions, not what I want things to be, or focus on there should be things. I just want, I like to play video games and these things because I get to observe what they can be, what they are from other people. So when we talk about, like, if I talk about sleeping dogs and I talk about like, it's gonna be really tough, or a sequel for sleeping dogs, that tells you something. It tells you something about the Chinese culture and China in general, that you either decide to accept. I'm more of an accepting person, and The reason why there isn't a sequel is because I know the reality, right? It's the reality of the situation. It goes true with Russia and, Ukraine. There's a lot of those things, and I see those things. But I'm not going out to tell anyone that things should be the way they are. Life has so many different perspectives and culture. If you spend most of your life trying to change people's realities, you spend a lot of time in your own head. And it makes it really difficult to understand other people if you spend most of the time in your own head. And that's why games are great, and movies and books. Personally, for myself, I think it's great that people tell me things that I don't understand because I can't be them anymore. And video games is a great way to do that. These specific video games. You're not going to find me playing a lot of like create your own character video games too often because I can tell you about myself without having to play a game about myself. So generally speaking, if there's a game series where it's really great and you're creating your own character and then the character is an extension of you, that's great. I will watch other people play because I get to learn. That type of video game will tell me a lot about the person I'm watching. So in order to understand someone, like if you like to play character creation games and stuff, like games that you can create the character you like, I will watch that because I learn a lot about the person who's playing that game. They create the character in their own, like their desire in their own image. I tend to not do that because I can do two things at once. I can play a game like this and tell you a story about myself. So I don't have to play a game to tell you about myself by by projecting into the game. I can play a different game which talks about culture elsewhere, and I can share a story about myself. And that's kind of the goal of these experiences. I talk about culture a lot because I want to illustrate that there are lots of things I don't know about other people's culture, and I want to know about other people's culture. However, you may not always be able to have the opportunity, and China's one of them. I say I'm Chinese, but I also know that all my Chinese values and culturalism is the closest thing is what my parents have taught me and influenced me, not China itself. And to me, I am bittersweet about it. Like, if I give you a personal opinion about my feelings, it is a shame that China is incredibly competitive in the public space, as in they're incredibly strong competitive face culture. And because of that, me as an American, I can't ever be able to know about China well enough, because what makes China work and their cultures and the people that live there that is trying really, really hard to make their country as great as it can be, a consequence of all of that is that we can't see it. So me living in America, me living in the United States, I don't have the opportunity to learn about China because I understand what keeps China from disclosing certain things. It's against their culture. So you have to understand and accept and be willing to willing to be tolerant that, yeah, you won't hear too much about China's problems or China's things because the way their culture works prevents that from happening. And that makes it so that I can appreciate, but still feel a little bittersweet about it. And Japan, I like Japan because I know I get a chance like to play these games because they're a bit more open. In fact, I would say the reason why Japan is incredibly trendy in the United States is because they, as in the country's developers and publishers, openly go out of their way to try to reach specifically the American audience, because they have a higher enrichment in American English. Pretty much all the localizations tend to use American English as the reference most of the time. So it's suggesting that in the Japanese culture, they're more willing to communicate with the American audience. And that's usually why also the American audience has an infatuation with Japanese culture most of the time, because it's most available. Like, pragmatically speaking, without feelings or morals or ethics or like bias or anything, Japanese makes their culture more available to the United States. So inherently, when it's more available, there are more people who are interested in it. And it's not that China is any less interesting. It's not. It's just as interesting. But their culture prevents themselves from being readily available to the United States. So it's hard for me, even as a Chinese person, to feel more attached to China than to Japan, because I don't get the privilege to know about China. And I know that you're from Russia, because you and Worm Gang and stuff, and Zek, I call him Zek, and I don't get to see that either. I don't, as an American, I know arguably even less about Russia than China, because I was born Chinese American. So even then, I know even less about Russia because of differences in culture, politics, religion, that keeps us from understanding each other. And it sounds, what I'm saying pretty much sounds like a typical American. Americans tend to be like, there's not enough information. At least that's how I want to represent the United States. The United States tend to be people who require explicit information. So if that stereotype of how like half of the United States tend to be always be overly concerned with everything, is because it's scary when you don't know enough. So you tend to not say anything about certain things because you don't know enough about it. I don't like everything the United States does, but thanks to Worm, on the Ukrainian side, they still believe that there are adequate people from Russia's side, and he's friends with me. It means a lot to me. Yeah, oh, that's nice. It's nice to hear these things. In the end of the day, for me, I sound like a sappy American. Americans tend to be like, yeah, we live in a country that pretty much everyone knows about the problems, because in the United States, the common thing is to distribute your problems. So it sounds really sappy, because if it's everyone's problem, everyone's going to have to solve it. In other countries like China, like at least my parents, if it's our problem, we got to solve it so that we don't bring shame and bring like damage to reputation of being Chinese. So it's an incredibly different way to approach things. And yeah, Chinese people are quite self-sufficient because they have to be. It's part of their culture. And in the United States, when I share about video games and talk about Twitch and YouTube, it's the product of the United States. Because like, if you think about the culture in the United States, it's always about sharing. So even the most inane things like your problems, crying about things, complaining about things, it's incredibly Americanized. So watch me do this thing for the 100th time and watch me throw my controller across the room. Watch me be really happy. That's very American. Americans like for better or for worse, sharing all the bad things and the good things. And then other countries, there's a degree to that. I'll put China for myself. China is the most reclusive, and the United States is the most open. For better or for worse, they both are countries that perform really well in their own ways, and they both have non-overlapping problems. On the one hand, everyone knows about all the problems that are going on in the United States. On the other hand, you don't know anything that's going on in China. Both the countries are thriving, but they have very conflicting value systems and culture. But overall, it still works for both the countries. And I'm speaking for these two countries because China is still a mystery to me. But at least I have my parents to literally show that all my other friends that are American do not behave that way. And both my parents work well enough in a country that doesn't share their values. So in a way, it is possible. It is possible for different countries to still work together. And that's my bias. That's my personal bias because I am Chinese American, and being able to find that bridge between startling different cultures like America and China, it's possible because I'm the product of it. I am a product of that thing. So I do believe it's possible. It's tough though, and it comes with a lot of it comes with a lot of compromise. You have to compromise here and there. Yeah. I would love to know more about the Chinese culture. Unfortunately, the only thing that comes out of a face culture is all the stuff they're willing to share. And in the United States, it's difficult to only see half the picture. Like as an American, I would say, generally speaking, it's hard to know somebody if that somebody only tells you what they want you to see. And it's hard, and Japan is doing a great job, even though their culture don't really do that very inherently. But they're like in between. Like if China was at one end and America is at one end, Japan is still open. So games like video games are great because they're trying to bridge the gap. So they're trying to make their games, right? Right now it's like a renaissance, in my opinion, for Japanese made games. Because they're trying to understand how to appeal to Americans. And what they have done is inherently they start appealing to the Western culture. So it ends up appealing to not just the United States, but other places. And that's great. Now I'm curious if the United States are going to do the opposite. So far, not really. So far, not so much. There were a few things like Ubisoft used to do these things where they take different locations and they try to make something that was kind of Japanese / Chinese and stuff. And those things felt more like we're using Western philosophy building, like game building. but we gave it a Chinese or Japanese rap in context. So like what I mean by that is it's like the other games. Games that deal with, for like China, things that deal with the Monkey King, things that deal with maybe Journey to the West specifically, Journey to the West, Three Kingdoms. They use Western building philosophy and dialogue and behavior, but in Asian contexts. And that's kind of what RGG is doing, but they do one better. What I mean is they, not necessarily better as in like it's higher quality or lower quality, is they went even higher than that. They decided that all their games will have American jokes, the command of an American English, as in like dad jokes, idiosyncrasies. Like what I mean is like behavior and dialogue that is receptive to the United States, as opposed to a great example would be I have one. This is just because Riot Games have different priority, but Riot Games, the people who make League of Legends, or maybe even Blizzard, Activision Blizzard with Overwatch, whenever there's a character shooter, right? Like a hero shooter or a MOBA, they tend to feature from time to time Asian themed characters, especially Chinese and Japanese, but I'm gonna highlight the Chinese ones. It will be like, I don't know, it's usually the Monkey King, like Wukong is a typical one. What I know about Journey to the West as a Chinese person, like through my parents, is that Wukong behaves very differently and are concerned with very different things. However, when it appears in a European/American game, Wukong behaves like a European American character. It isn't someone who is trying to make a compromise to make Wukong like the representative of the culture it's coming from and then meeting halfway. So, for example, just a little bit ago, that slight digression about the naming system, it's not like that. Those are secondary to non-Asian made games so far. It's not their priority or their interest to try to depict characters like that. So like I would love to see an American made game that shows an American's experience in a Japanese setting. Movies do that though. There are movies that do that, and shows that do that really well, and I absolutely love those shows. But in video games, that hasn't happened yet. So like it's typically what Americans think strictly, and how foreigners like Japanese people, really like Japanese people, behave to the lens of Americans. And that is true. It's accurate, like what it is. But what makes RGG more interesting is because I'm not Japanese. So I want to know what Japanese people think of Americans, so, or like other countries. So whenever they feature one of those, I can see what is not American, that's purely Japanese perspective, and then I can also see the stuff they're trying to do that is strictly American, while they have American characters, well, Americanized characters. So in this game, it's not a big deal. Like, it's not a centerpiece because the stuff is inherently Japanese. But I'm looking forward to when they do. And I think they're already doing it, because the way they translate the Japanese stuff into American English, I'm getting an American vibe that tells me that they understand how Americans process humor, and how Americans have similar problems that Japanese people have, but the context is strictly Japanese. Like, for example, all the problems or promiscuity and stuff dealing with hostesses, like host clubs or relationship stuff, there is similarity, but at the same time, the stuff they talk about, the context is inherently Japanese. It's not mutually understanding in the United States. Like, it's rarely understanding in the United States. However, they used the translation to show the same emotions, but for something that an American person can understand, which I have yet to find a game that's the reverse. Anyways, that's a good digression for the for today. But yeah, multiculturalism, fantastic. Sleeping dogs, I would not be surprised if I had to call, like taking it back to the beginning again, I would not be surprised that there will be a sleeping dog game, a spiritual sequel that features Chinese Americans. So like Chinatowns of the United States would be the closest thing, because what they depict in those Chinatowns would be open to Chinese Americans. And this is not to sound offensive to myself or any way, but Chinese American culture is very distinctively different from Chinese culture now. It's gotten to the point where it might be okay, because to me, and this is a personal thing, anecdotally, Chinese people don't see me as a Chinese person. They see me as a Chinese American person. In fact, they would probably go as far generalize that I am an American person. So when you make video games that deal with Chinese Americans in the United States, it's not a reflection on Chinese culture. And that is a great deep cut that we'll shelve for another day. But one thing has to be emphasized, that a lot of times when you're watching YouTube, especially YouTube or on the internet, you have to know where the source of the information has come from. Because in general, any country that has a strong face culture, if you're getting information about that country on the internet, it's likely from an Americanized source. And as someone who is Chinese American, it is not reflective accurately enough of Chinese culture. I can talk about what I know about Chinese culture here, like, you know, I'm sharing about what I know about Asian culture as an extension of my multiculturalism, but it's in no way saying that it is accurate reflection of the country my parents came from. Because now, even in the real truth of the matter, when I interact with a Chinese person, that Chinese person sees me as a representative of the country I was born and raised, not the country that I have a heritage from. So Chinese people don't see me technically as a Chinese person. They see me as a Chinese American or an American person. And that's kind of tough for those who are very prideful. I'm more open-minded in this case, and I think it's fair, because I can't possibly tell you what it's like to live in China. I really would want to know. And these games are interesting because it provides a lens into it.